And then we'll go over that verse and see if you have any questions on the verse. Okay, it's one question. When the Buddha refers to true men, is he referencing the Purisa Sutta, the true man? Yes, I believe he is. So, the word true men, that's probably, that word might be a little bit difficult to translate into English. So the translation of true men, you have to understand what that means. That refers to the Arhant. Now, of course, that implies women also, because women can also attain Arhantship. That means complete liberation, the destruction of the 10 fetters, and the attainment of Arhantship. And so women, nuns also attain that. So it would also refer to them or anybody who attained Arhantship, whether they were a man or a woman. But as we know, back in those days, when they say men, they included all of, the human race. Women too. But anyway, so yeah, the true men lead to those the destruction of the fetters that keep us bound to the wheel of suffering. This next question. When the Buddha refers to Brahmins, is he referring to the Hindu class of Brahmins or something else? Thank you. Well, from my understanding, which may not be perfect in terms of, Brahmins all the way, but a Brahmin is also kind of a name for an Arhant, a Brahmin. And in some instances, a person is not a Brahmin by birth. That means, in India, you are born, as you mentioned there, in the Brahmin caste. But when the Buddha referred to Brahmins, he was in a different way, because on several instances, he said a person is not a Brahmin by birth, only by the deeds. So the Brahmin in that sense is the pure mind. So even these true men with this Purisa could say they were a Brahmin, even though they're not in the Brahmin caste, even though they were not born in the Brahmin caste. If a person attained the Arahantship, then the Buddha, that's a kind of another one of many sort of epitaphs or nicknames that the Buddha would call that an Arahant, a Brahmin, in the true sense of the word. But so, it could be when he's criticizing Brahmins, he was referring to that Brahmin caste, but when he was talking about mentioning the word Brahmin in other instances, I already mentioned. And there in the Dhammapada, in fact, one of the last verses in the Dhammapada is the Brahmana Vagga, about Brahmins. And it was about this idea that the Brahmin is with the pure mind, not being born as a Brahmin, not by birth, but by the pure mind. Next question. When I do meditation on the 4 foundations of mindfulness, Sometimes when I get to the part where I observe thoughts, there are many thoughts that pass by. But other times there are almost no thoughts at all. Is one of these states more desirable? And if so, should I be doing something differently sometimes? Well, the 4 foundations of mindfulness, you see, they cover every possibility of experience that can come to us. So if you're having some particular difficulty with the physical body, identifying whether there's some sickness, at that time you can then contemplate the mindfulness of the body. But at other times, when there's nothing particularly going on with the body, if you're having more difficulty with mind states, then you can contemplate the mind states. By recognizing each state of mind. Okay, now the mind is not concentrated, or now the mind is concentrated, or now the mind is deluded, now the mind is not deluded, now the mind is full of hatred, now the mind is full of non-hatred. So that's if when it arises, that's when you contemplate it. And because all those things are connected, because the feelings also, the feeling will trigger off these thoughts. So and the feelings are occurring also within the body. So they're not really separate. It's whatever. Now you can contemplate the 4 foundations one at a time, but still all of them are occurring almost all the time, unless you're in a jhana where all your thoughts have stopped. But then you still have perception and feelings. But so, whatever particular things, if you're having more trouble dealing with feelings, you contemplate the feelings and observing them as they're arising, how your mind is affected by them, and then of course in the 4th foundation, the Dhammanupassana, then that basically includes everything, because in the 5 aggregates, you also have the body, feelings, perceptions, mental states, which are the volitional formations, and the consciousness also. So really, when you practice the 4 foundations, they're listed as 4 to give a kind of an idea. One leads to the other, but in actual practice, when you're meditating, whatever the hindrance is, if it's a physical hindrance, then you by contemplating the body, if it helps you let go of that, fine. If it's a feeling, a pleasant or painful feeling that's harassing your mind, you contemplate that until it goes off. If it's a mental state, you contemplate that. And then the Dhammanupassana is actually the deepest of all those 4 foundations of mindfulness. The first 3 are just the kind of a training to get you detached from those things. But in the deeper sense of vipassana really starts when you start practicing Dhammanupassana. And when the mind has weakened those 5 hindrances, and you start to develop the enlightenment factors. That's when really mindfulness and vipassana awareness starts to kick into high gear. Okay. Here's one I missed. The Noble Eightfold Path seems to be a paradox. It is a conditioned thing that is said to help one reach the unconditioned. How is it conditioned? It's conditioned because, it's using the mind and thinking. So like right understanding and right thought, right speech. Okay, you're conditioning yourself. You're practicing sila and abandoning negative actions. You're cultivating certain wholesome thoughts. So that's a positive conditioning. So practicing the Noble Eightfold Path is a positive conditioning, and that positive conditioning helps to weaken the negative conditioning. And then in the end, you reach the unconditioned, but that's only at the very end. So it's like if you have a thorn, if you get a sticker or a thorn in your finger, sometimes you use another thorn to get it out, right? So we use conditioned thoughts to remove we use wholesome conditioned thoughts to remove the negative conditioned thoughts. Those are the ones that bring suffering. Again, the whole Eightfold Path, the Four Noble, about suffering and the ending of suffering, not about the ending of happiness. So it's about the ending of suffering. And so by cultivating the Eightfold Path, it helps us to reach the end of suffering. And when we reach that, all of those things can be transcended easily. Even the wholesome conditioning can be let go of. So anyway, that's how we use the conditioned, it's called the mundane Eightfold Path. So the conditioned Eightfold Path that's the mundane Eightfold Path before you reach the Sotapanna stage. Once you reach the Sotapanna stage, because you have a glimpse of the unconditioned truth, now you're on the supramundane Eightfold Path, where the conditioning is much weaker, although there still is conditioning. But now you have that unconditioned wisdom that's helping you to achieve greater, deeper progress. So eventually it reaches the unconditioned state. Okay, so that looks like that might be the end of the chat questions. I hope I was able to answer your questions.
There is one more.
Where?
On the end.
Down at the bottom?
Yes. That's 716.
In thinking of the concept of self or not self, I categorize 3 instances as the following: me, mine, or myself. I, me, or sometimes referred as me, mine, myself, I, me, or mine. Because that's the way the ego manifests. So all of our thoughts, are directed at, like me or I. So I'm going here, I think this, I think that, I like this, I like that. So, we're always using this idea of I. And then there's the me, the dative case, give it to me, look at me, don't hurt me, and so on. And then there's mine, this is mine, this is mine. Or, this is not mine. So those are what I call the Trinity of the Ego, I, me, and mine. So yes, that is the way the Buddha is his instructions on reflecting on the sense of all these five aggregates are, this is not me, this is not mine, this is not myself. He repeated that hundreds and hundreds of times over again in so many sutras. That's in regard to the five aggregates: form, feeling, perception, volition, consciousness. In any one of those five, we're regarding them as either I, me, or mine. And so it's cutting that out. It's by contemplating that, you're weakening the root of that thought of clinging to the concept, so that at a certain point, you will be able to have transcendence, and that sense of I, me, mine will. So that is the correct approach, because that's the Buddha's instructions. You know, I mean, you can't get any more clearer than that.
There's a follow-up question to that. So it is not in relation of other things? It is in relation.
The five aggregates comprise everything in the universe. There's nothing apart from the five aggregates. So, you know, the five aggregates is anything we can possibly conceive of is within the five aggregates. And he says, all these five aggregates are not me, not mine, not myself. So that covers everything. It's in relation to everything. Name one thing that's not a part of the five aggregates. Donald Trump, yeah, he's a concept in your mind. He's a visible object. He's a hearing object. Or even the Buddha. You hear the word Buddha and it produces a perception in your mind, an idea. Even though there's some reality behind it, but still we're talking about in our mind, how our mind is, these things are all happening within our mind.
So then Bhante, it's like like one is this understanding this part. So then what should we contemplate? Like our thing is like, this is a concept, you know, this is an illusion. Then how should I contemplate? Like, okay, this thoughts are coming, like thinking, like as you mentioned, or I'm like looking at the sensation, what I'm experiencing. How would you juxtapose with the experience part of it? Because then concept is one thing we understand. This is
you're thinking about these things from the standpoint of yourself and ego. That's why the ego has to be transcended. Once you and that's what this question is that I was just going to, this one that was in between. It says, can you explain how consciousness becomes universal? Mm-hmm. It's because we're stuck in the I, me, or mine consciousness. It's the consciousness that really is the ultimate thing we have to contemplate. Body, feeling, perception, volition, and so on. These are just activities of the ego, but that's what the ego is clinging to. Once we give up body, we give up feeling, we give up the mind. The consciousness is the last thing, and then we have to direct our attention on the consciousness itself to dissolve it, like that ice cube dissolving in the water. That's why I use that. That's the best analogy that I can come up with about how that experience of ego consciousness dissolves in order to become universal consciousness, which is this question looks like asked by Nisanko or Hemanta. But this idea of how consciousness becomes universal, basically, I guess what you mean by universal, it means it becomes free from the ego. It becomes just pure awareness. That's what sometimes people refer to as universal consciousness. And it becomes universal because its nature is universal. It's only the defilements and the defilements of the greed, hatred, and delusion that has purified it. Like in the Buddha's statement, this mind is essentially pure, but it's only been defiled by the defilements. That's in one of the, I think, Udana verses. Amongst this mind is luminous, the luminous mind. It means the mind that's free from the ego and dualistic conditioning, but it's only covered over by these 10 fetters and hindrances and fetters and all these other things. And how does it become that? By practicing the Eightfold Path, by developing the factors of enlightenment, by attaining the stages of stream entry, once returning, never returning, and the Arhantship. That is how it becomes universal. Because its nature is universal, so to speak. If it wasn't, then it wouldn't be able to attain liberation. So this last part of the last question, I guess it was talking about the ego. So there's no duality or separateness between entities or objects. The duality is created in our consciousness. But it's very difficult, to clearly kind of explain that in our limited language and so on. But the separateness and the duality is created within our consciousness through the conditioned process. But of course, even the Buddha, that's only, of course, when one has reached the Arhantship. But even the Buddha could see people as outside of himself, but he wasn't deluded about it. He saw the world around him. So there were, kind of a separateness as entities in a certain way, but it was radically different than how we experience it with our conditioned minds. But once the Arhat dies, then that's a different kettle of fish. That's the Nibbana without the 5 aggregates, because there's 2 types of liberation, one that still has the 5 aggregates, and then what happens to the mind after that the Arhat dies. Then there would be really adequately describe those probably more directly and clearly. But so now coming to this, in fact, this verse seems to fit in with some of these questions that we've just been discussing. So mindfulness is the path to the deathless. Now, actually, Ajahn Sumedho wrote a little booklet called Mindfulness is the Path to the Deathless. And it's a very wonderful little book. But the actual word is appamada. In the Dhammapada verse, it's in the appamada vaga, which means heedfulness. So appamada is the word. But heedfulness and mindfulness are often used kind of synonymously. Because when you're heedful, that means you're very mindful and you're very circumspect and so on. So, because heedfulness is not a very common word, people don't use it very often in the English language. But mindfulness, because it's such a common word now and practice. So, I think that's why you and I prefer, that way of translating it. Mindfulness is the path to the deathless. That means the deathless means Nibbana, the end of suffering. And it means that transcendence of the ego consciousness, I was just, explaining in a few different ways by following the Eightfold Path, developing the factors of enlightenment, practicing the Dhammanupasana, the four foundations of mindfulness. That is the path to the deathless. That the deathless means the attainment of Nibbana. And again, and then the mindful do not die, because the death is referring not only to the physical body, but to the consciousness. So the mindful, what is the meaning of the mindfulness is the path to the deathless, and unmindfulness is the path to death. That means if you haven't attained enlightenment, you're going to go on in the rounds of birth and death indefinitely. But once you attain the Arhantship, then basically you've transcended death already, because ultimately death means ego death. So the Buddha reached ego death with his attainment of enlightenment when he was 35 years old. So for 45 years, basically he was already reached the deathless state in terms of the consciousness, but he still had the physical body. So that's why in Buddhist terminology, we don't say the Buddha died. The Buddha attained parinibbana. Death is for somebody whose mind is going to be reborn again, and they're going to be then there's birth and death. But so the mindful do not die. That means a person who's attained arahantship. That means their mind has attained the deathless state. So the deathless state means it's not going to die. It's not born and is not going to die. The deathless, amata dhamma. That's what the meaning of it. The mindful do not die, but it only refers to the arahant. And the unmindful are as if dead already, because the unmindful, they keep on strengthening their ego consciousness, over and over and over and over and over again. And their mind is still revolving through samsara. So the birth and death refers to the samsara. Now for an arahant, samsara has stopped, even though, because it refers to the mind and the ego consciousness arising and vanishing, powered by the dependent origination. But the arahant has already transcended the dependent origination in terms of the cessation of suffering. So that really the death of the physical body of an arahant is not really considered the real death. His mind already died to ignorance, died to greed, hatred, and delusion, and to any attachment. So that's considered the deeper meaning of